Harvard's top mathematician spent years on that equation. But the woman who solved it didn't even have a degree. She pushed a mop bucket, wore bleach-stained sneakers, and carried the answer in a spiral notebook no one asked to see. Until one afternoon, she stood up in the last row, and the room would never be the same. Lila Carter had never intended to walk into Harvard's Maxwell Lecture Hall that day. Her shift had ended 30 minutes earlier. She still smelled faintly of cleaning fluid and lemon wax. Her sneakers, dulled from years of bleach, squeaked softly on the marble floor. She kept her head down, shoulders hunched, like she always did when students rushed past her with $1,000 backpacks and eyes that never saw her. But that day, something was different. In her worn canvas tote bag, tucked beneath an extra pair of gloves and a half-eaten protein bar, sat her blue spiral notebook. Its pages were frayed, the margins filled with notes scribbled in pencil during midnight laundry cycles, hospital waiting rooms, and diner coffee breaks. And on one of those pages was something that had been bothering her for years. A pattern. A gap. A rhythm that didn't quite fit. She had read about it first in a crumpled journal she found discarded in MIT's public archive bin. The article was dense, too dense probably, but she'd copied it word for word into her notebook anyway, thinking maybe one day, if she looked at it long enough, the numbers would whisper back. They did. But Lila wasn't a mathematician, not officially. She wasn't even a student. She was 37, a janitor, a single mom, someone who knew how to balance equations on the backs of diner receipts, but not how to pronounce topology without second-guessing herself. Still, she walked into the lecture hall. It was quiet, almost reverent, as she slipped through the side door. Wooden seats curved like an ancient amphitheater, tiered all the way up to the stained glass windows near the ceiling. Students murmured. Some laughed. A few professors stood near the front, one of them tall and sharp-suited, gesturing at a blackboard scrawled with equations that looked like Greek to most. Dr. Charles Mercer. They called him the Blade behind his back. Harvard's most feared professor in applied mathematics. His brow alone had ended more than one doctoral defense. Tenure was his armor. Precision was his weapon. And today, he was lecturing on a decades-old problem in post-quantum encryption. Lila didn't belong here. She took a seat in the back row, careful not to make the old wood creak. No one turned to look. No one asked her name. Perfect. She watched as Mercer spoke with the ease of a man used to being right. He moved like he owned the chalk, the board, the building. His voice clipped, confident. He explained how previous transformations had failed, how the Takahashi conundrum still hadn't been resolved. How this, he said, pointing to the center of the board, was the best reduction model available today. Lila blinked. She tilted her head. No. It was close. Beautiful, even. But it wasn't right. Her fingers curled around the pencil in her lap. She had worked through that transformation at least a dozen times, and each time, no matter how she rearranged it, there was a subtle flaw, one that only showed itself if you looked past the traditional approach and into the noise between variables. Dr. Mercer continued, his words rising in tempo. The formulation on the board, he declared, remains the most efficient path to a recursive prime-based encryption schema. Unless someone here, he smiled thinly, has something better. He was joking. No one dared respond. But then, somehow... Lila's hand went up. She didn't plan it. Didn't even realize it was rising until the weight of 100 eyes shifted toward her. A few students turned. Some chuckled. "Uh-oh," someone whispered. Dr. Mercer paused, squinting toward the back. "Yes," he said. "Did you have a question?" Lila stood. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "I was wondering about the fourth transformation, specifically the constraint applied to the nonlinear term." The room fell silent. Dr. Mercer blinked. "What about it?" "If applied outside the Takahashi boundary, wouldn't it introduce an inconsistency in the lower matrix?" she asked. There it was. A crack. Not in the math, but in the room. Dr. Mercer raised a single brow. "And you are?" "Lila Carter," she said. "And what department are you with?" "I'm not with any department," she admitted. "I work in facilities." Laughter flickered, not cruel but amused, dismissive. "Facilities," Mercer repeated, like tasting something sour. "And you believe there's an error in my derivation?" "Not an error," Lila said quickly. "Just a misapplied assumption." Mercer let the silence hang like a sword over her head. Then he stepped aside. "Well then," he said, voice like cold steel, "why don't you show us?" She hesitated only a moment. The chalk was cold in her hand. The blackboard loomed larger than anything she'd faced in years. Not because it was difficult, no, because this moment wasn't supposed to happen. Not to people like her. She walked forward. Each step echoed, reminding the room she was real, visible, no longer part of the background. When she reached the board, the numbers unfolded in her mind. They weren't just calculations. They were rhythms, memories, a language she had learned by heart, in silence, over years of invisibility. She wrote. Slow at first, then faster. Correction, substitution, constraint. Pause. Then, with one final mark, she stepped back. The room exhaled. Dr. Mercer studied the board. His mouth parted slightly. The corner of his eye twitched. It wasn't just correct. It was elegant, condensed, intuitive. "That's one interpretation," he said stiffly. Another student whispered, "She just corrected Mercer." Lila didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply returned to her seat and wrapped her arms around the old notebook in her bag, the one with years of quiet brilliance etched in pencil and hope. In that moment, she didn't know this was only the beginning. That within days, whispers would turn to questions. Questions would turn to invitations. And one of them would come from MIT. But for now, Lila Carter sat in the back row, chalk dust still clinging to her hands, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. And the numbers, always loyal, hummed like a symphony in her mind. The headlines hadn't come yet. The applause hadn't either. But somewhere in the endless corridors of Harvard, whispers had begun to stir. Whispers about the janitor who walked into the lion's den and wrote the lion's equation better than he could. Lila Carter didn't hear them, though. She was back in the quiet storage room where they kept old brooms, half-empty bottles of degreaser, and the stack of mop heads no one ever labeled properly. The air smelled of ammonia. The lights buzzed faintly. And on the bench behind a cart of supplies, she sat staring down at her spiral notebook, the one no one had ever asked to see. Page 47. The Takahashi collapse restructured under non-linear constraints, the same page she'd copied in the dark 4 years ago in a laundromat at 2 a.m., while her daughter Emily slept across 2 chairs beside her. A peanut butter sandwich in a plastic bag, a calculator bought from a thrift shop, a Bic pen that ran out halfway through the derivation. She'd finished it in pencil, then never showed anyone, until today. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. It was Emily. Emily, text. "Everything okay? The sitter said you stayed late." Lila didn't know how to reply. What did you say, after standing up in front of Harvard's best and solving the equation that haunted them for years? Instead, she typed, "I'll explain tonight. I did something brave today." Then she locked her phone and exhaled. That night, Lila didn't sleep. She brewed old tea and sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the notebook. Each page was a timestamp, every formula inked during unpaid overtime, every marginal note scrawled after hospital visits and rent notices and gas station coffee. Some pages were stained from when Emily had the flu. Some had tiny crayon doodles in the corners, drawn by her daughter when there wasn't enough money for a babysitter, and Lila had to bring her into the night shifts. To most people, this notebook looked like a mess. To her, it was a map out of silence. But the world had never asked for it. Until now. The next morning, something strange happened. As Lila approached the Maxwell Hall janitor's closet, a man in a black coat stood waiting, thin, white hair, hands behind his back. "Ms. Carter?" he asked. She slowed. "Yes?" He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a sealed envelope. Inside, a cream card embossed with silver. Dr. Margaret Ellison, Department of Advanced Mathematics, MIT. "I'd like to speak with you. Today, 4:00 p.m., Building 2. No explanation. No flattery. Just the kind of card that people normally handed to people like Mercer. People with titles. Not people who wiped chalkboards at night. Lila almost didn't go. The moment she stood outside MIT's Building 2, she felt it. The difference. Here, the walls didn't whisper doubt. They watched you. Judged you. Wondered why you were standing there with a canvas tote bag and sneakers that still smelled faintly of bleach. But Lila walked in anyway. The office was sparse, modern, glass and walnut. On one wall were framed articles. Ellison's variable collapse, unsolvable models and the women who proved otherwise, Takahashi revisited. And in the center, behind a desk of polished steel, sat Dr. Margaret Ellison. Gray hair swept back, eyes like old steel sharpened by fire. "You brought it?" she asked. Lila nodded. She placed the notebook on the table, gently, like it might break. Ellison opened it without hesitation. Page 1, page 2, then 20, then 30. At first, her expression was polite, then quiet. Then her hand stopped turning pages altogether. "Where did you learn this transformation?" she asked, tapping a line Lila had written beside a stained coffee ring. I didn't, Lila said honestly. I saw it, in a pattern. It didn't work the way the book said it should, so I changed it. Ellison's brow lifted. You changed a group transformation? I didn't know it had a name, Lila said. By page 50, Ellison called in another professor. By page 60, a third. Whispers followed. They huddled over the notebook like it was something sacred, their voices low, urgent, careful. Lila sat frozen, her hands tucked under the edge of the chair. Her heart was pounding, but not with fear. With the kind of trembling only felt when someone finally asks you to speak after a decade of silence. Finally, Ellison looked up. Would you consider working with us formally? She asked. As a research assistant, maybe more. We can sponsor a fellowship. It won't be easy, but it would be worth it. Lila blinked. Was this real? She thought of Emily, of the notice on their apartment door last month, of the night the power was shut off and they'd finished algebra homework by candlelight. Then she said softly, I'd have to ask my babysitter if she can do more mornings. Ellison smiled. We'll make it work. But not everyone wanted it to work. By that evening, Dr. Charles Mercer had received an anonymous packet on his desk, printed scans of Lila's notebook, with a sticky note. Your guest lecturer is now rewriting cryptographic foundations. Thought you'd want to know. Mercer stared at the equations. His lips tightened, not because they were wrong, but because they weren't. And yet something in him refused to yield. She was a janitor. No credentials, no publications, no authority. If Harvard let this stand, what did that say about him? His eyes narrowed. He tapped his pen against the edge of the desk. Back at her apartment, Lila finally told Emily. The diner shift had ended. Emily wore her red apron and smelled of coffee and grease. They sat on the small couch, legs folded, the air still warm from the old radiator. They want me at MIT, Lila said, almost in a whisper. Dr. Ellison, she wants to work with me. Emily froze, then her eyes welled up. You're serious? Lila nodded. They said the models I wrote, some of them go beyond what's been published. Emily covered her mouth. I told you, she whispered. I always told you, Mom. Then she jumped up and ran into her room, returned with an old purple notebook covered in glitter stickers. Look, she said, flipping it open. Inside, a drawing of Lila with a cape, holding a chalkboard. My mom is a math superhero, written in shaky handwriting. Age, 9. Lila stared at it. Tears she didn't know she'd buried finally reached the surface. You saw it, she said. Emily smiled. I always did. They're just catching up. But while one door was opening, another one was already being planned shut. Dr. Mercer made a call that night. Not to a colleague, but to a tech liaison in Washington. Someone with clearance. Someone who understood how dangerous compression breakthroughs could be if left in the wrong hands. This woman, Mercer said, voice low. She's on to something, and she doesn't know what she's sitting on. The voice on the other end paused. Then we'll need to see it for ourselves. MIT's Building 32 looked unassuming from the outside. Gray panels, glass. No sign to announce what brilliance lived inside. But behind its modest walls, one of the most consequential decisions in quantum research was already being quietly set in motion. Lila Carter stood just outside the conference room door. In her arms, 3 spiral notebooks. In her chest, a heart that refused to slow down. This wasn't just another hallway. It was the place where people like her were rarely invited. And if they were, it was usually through the back, holding a mop. But not today. Inside, Dr. Margaret Ellison was already waiting, joined now by 2 senior professors from the Department of Applied Mathematics, and one man in a dark blazer whose name tag read, Dr. Leo Ashcroft, MIT Center for Quantum Research. He didn't smile when she entered. He studied her like a problem. Ellison, on the other hand, stood and gestured to a chair. Lila, thank you for coming. Lila nodded. She sat, adjusting the tote on her lap. Ashcroft was the first to speak. We've reviewed your notebooks, all 3. He tapped a file in front of him. In particular, your approach to recursive prime compression using nonlinear boundary constraints. It's ahead of where we currently are. Lila blinked. It was just an idea, she said softly. Ashcroft leaned forward. Ideas don't solve encryption bottlenecks that have blocked our field for 20 years. Ellison smiled faintly. We'd like to offer you a formal visiting researcher position here at MIT. Sponsored fellowship, housing support, full campus access. Lila's breath caught. That sounds like more than I'm qualified for. No, Ellison said. It's exactly what you're qualified for. The world just didn't know where to look. One of the older professors, with salt and pepper hair and tortoise-shell glasses, chimed in. We'll handle the credential exemptions. We've done it before, for extraordinary cases. Your mind qualifies, and your work deserves to be published. Lila swallowed hard. The word published echoed in her. She'd never imagined her name could sit in a journal, let alone with equations beside it. I don't have a degree, she said. I never even finished community college. Ashcroft's voice softened, just a fraction. We're not looking for degrees. We're looking for the mind behind those notebooks. Lila hesitated, then opened her tote. She pulled out the oldest of the 3 notebooks, the one with the tear in the corner and Emily's crayon doodles in the margins. If I say yes, she whispered, I want to keep using this. Not a laptop, not at first. This is where it all lives. Ellison looked at the worn pages, the taped spine, the marks of survival. She nodded. Then this notebook becomes part of our history. But across the river, in an oak-paneled office at Harvard, Dr. Charles Mercer had no intention of letting that history write itself unchecked. He'd known secrets were currency in academia. But power, that came from who got to decide what mattered. And what Lila had shown on that blackboard? That threatened the entire hierarchy. He'd made the call 2 nights ago. The man on the other end hadn't given a name. Just a directive. Send the notebooks. We'll evaluate the implications. If her model scales, it doesn't just break theory, it breaks systems. Now, Mercer stood watching as a courier retrieved a printed copy of Lila's work. He said nothing, just nodded. Because deep down, Mercer wasn't just trying to protect his pride. He was trying to protect the world from something it might not be ready for. Meanwhile, Lila sat on the floor of her apartment that night, surrounded by chaos and old paper. Emily, back from a long shift at the diner, stepped over 2 stacks of notes and blinked. Are we moving? Lila laughed. No, but I think I need a desk. Emily looked around at the coffee mugs, the scratch paper, the open textbooks, the diagram drawn on a pizza box. "You need a building," she said, grinning. Lila handed her a sheet of calculations. "This one here, I think it's the beginning of something. A compression model that doesn't just shrink, it predicts." Emily squinted at the numbers. "It looks like alien code." "It's structure," Lila said, "hidden in what we usually ignore." Emily smiled. "Sounds familiar." Lila looked up. "What do you mean?" "You," Emily said. "Your structure. They just didn't see it." Lila didn't reply, but her eyes watered as she folded the paper and slid it gently into the back of her notebook. The next morning, Lila stepped into her assigned MIT lab space. It wasn't large. Just 2 desks, a whiteboard, a skylight with an awkward leak in the corner. But it was hers. She placed the notebooks on the desk and stared at them for a long moment. No applause, no spotlights, just sunlight, quiet, and the beginning of something real. At 9 a.m., a grad student named Jalen knocked softly. "You're the one who rewrote Mercer's constraint model?" Lila blinked. I guess so." Jalen smiled. "We've been passing that equation around since freshman year. You changed the curve." He paused. "It's good to have you here." Lila smiled faintly. "It's good to be seen." But even as she said it, a strange weight pressed behind her ribs. She was being seen now. Yes. But who was watching? At that same hour, Dr. Mercer stood in a quiet meeting room beneath a federal building in D.C. On the table before him, a printed version of Lila's compression model. Beside it, a closed folder marked Classified Post-Quantum Risk Assessment. Name, Carter, Lila. Civilian. Origin, non-academic status, unverified. One agent, clean-cut, unreadable, flipped through the notes. "This is scalable," he said. "If she finishes this line of derivation, encryption as we know it folds." Mercer nodded. "She doesn't know what she's building." "That's what makes her dangerous," the agent replied. "People like her don't think in terms of containment." Mercer didn't reply, because part of him agreed, and part of him was starting to doubt that anyone could contain her at all. They didn't call it that officially, the whispering room, but that's what the postdocs at MIT jokingly nicknamed the white-walled seminar chamber tucked on the 3rd floor of Building 32. It was where big ideas were quietly dissected, where visiting researchers were politely questioned, and where reputations, built on years of silent work, could vanish in a single afternoon. Lila Carter walked into it holding a dry erase marker and a spiral notebook. She was no longer the janitor. Not here. Now, she was the woman from Harvard. The one who'd walked into Dr. Mercer's lecture and rewritten the problem that half the department had long since labeled not solvable. But respect came slow in rooms like this. And Lila could feel it before she even spoke. 5 people sat across from her, a small panel of senior researchers and graduate fellows. All polite, all technically welcoming, but none of them smiled like they meant it. They didn't see her as a fraud. They just weren't sure yet if she was real. Dr. Margaret Ellison introduced her with warmth and precision. Lila Carter will be presenting her current approach to nonlinear prime compression with recursive modular reduction. She is not formally credentialed, but her work speaks for itself. Then she stepped aside. Lila clicked the cap off her marker. Her palms were sweating, her knees stiff. She had stayed up until 2 a.m. rewriting the last section. Emily had helped, reading through her metaphors, catching where she'd rambled, timing her pauses. And now here she was, no podium, no script, just a whiteboard, a clock, and the weight of having to prove again that what she saw wasn't luck. Lila began slowly. "This is a simplified version of the Takahashi constraint set," she said, writing a base formula on the board. "The inefficiency begins when we assume the prime sequence must remain monotonic under constraint layering." Someone near the wall raised an eyebrow. "But if we invert the compression logic," she circled the term, "and treat the error field as a mapping function rather than noise, we create a predictable compression window, one that's recursive but not redundant." For a moment, no one said anything. Then a graduate student in a striped sweater raised his hand. "Where did you learn to see it that way?" Lila paused. "I didn't learn it anywhere. I watched it misbehave in the wrong sequence for 5 years. It kept folding on itself. So I let it." He frowned. "Let it?" "I mean," she corrected gently, "I let it fail first, then tried to understand why it failed, instead of forcing it back into the model." Another professor scribbled something down. Ellison's eyes glimmered. That was the moment it changed. The tone shifted, from disbelief to curiosity, from quiet judgment to analytical silence. By the time she finished, the board was full. Half notations, elegant transformations, unbroken logic. She stepped back. Her hands still shook. But she knew what she had written made sense. She had felt it click. Afterward, the questions came. Not condescending ones, real ones. What if the sequence collapses under an irrational limit? Could this apply to modular ciphers? Have you tested for data loss under scaling? Lila answered all she could. She admitted what she hadn't explored. She didn't bluff, and that, oddly, impressed them more. Later that afternoon, back in her new shared office, Lila sat staring at the window. The city outside was gray. Snow lingered in the corners of the sidewalks like crumbs. Across the desk, her office mate, a polite, overworked postdoc named Anya, finally broke the silence. "You did good today," she said. Lila smiled faintly. "Thanks." "I mean it," Anya continued. "You were scared, and you didn't pretend not to be. That's rare around here." Lila looked down at her notebook. "I'm used to being invisible. Being seen like this, it's harder than it looks." Anya tilted her head. "So, why do it?" Lila thought for a moment, then answered quietly, "Because I spent too many years solving things in the dark, problems no one asked me to look at, equations I couldn't stop thinking about. I thought maybe if I proved something important, someone would finally ask how I saw it." Anya didn't reply, but she didn't have to. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's respect. Meanwhile, across campus, Dr. Leo Ashcroft sat with Dr. Ellison in a small corner lounge, sipping his coffee like it was data. "She's sharper than they expected," he said. Ellison nodded. "She's seeing structures no one else even thinks to question." Ashcroft hesitated. But what?" Ellison asked, already knowing the answer. "She's not careful," he said. "Not with how she talks. not with who's listening. If this model really scales, Lila Carter is about to become very visible. And visibility attracts the wrong kinds of interest. Ellison stiffened. She's not naive. No, but she's new. And this field, it eats its young, especially when they don't come from the club. He set down his mug. Keep her close, Margaret, before someone with more leverage gets to her. Lila didn't know about that conversation, but she felt the air shift the following week. First, it was the email, an invitation to speak at a closed-door seminar with a panel of encryption specialists. Then a LinkedIn message from a private lab in Palo Alto. We're following your work. Would love to talk. Then, Mercer's name showed up in her inbox. Not directly, just a forwarded memo from Harvard's administrative board. Dr. Charles Mercer will be hosting a closed review of recent developments in recursive compression next month. Visiting researchers contributing to similar areas of inquiry may attend upon request. It wasn't a threat, but it felt like one. Back at her apartment that night, Lila heated up leftover lentil soup and sat cross-legged on the floor with Emily. "You look tired," Emily said. Lila smiled. "I am. You okay?" Lila hesitated, then answered honestly. "I think people are starting to look at me like I don't belong again. But this time, for a different reason." Emily put down her spoon. "They're scared," she said. "You walked in from nowhere and did what they couldn't. People don't know what to do with that." Lila looked over. "What if I mess it up?" Emily didn't blink. "Then you'll fix it, like you always do." Lila looked down at her hands, so used to scrubbing, lifting, folding. They didn't look like the hands of someone meant to hold whiteboard markers and encryption models. But they were. They had earned it. The envelope came by hand. No email, no calendar invite, no digital trail, just a white linen envelope, slid under her lab door at MIT with no sender, only her name written in small, clean print. Lila Carter. Inside, a folded card. Heavy. Expensive. You are cordially invited to an invitation-only roundtable on frontier encryption theory, hosted at Harvard's Elman Hall, March 19th, 3:00 p.m. Your contributions have been noted. Dr. Charles Mercer. She stared at it for a long time, then flipped it over. Nothing else. Not even a signature. No threat. No promise. Just a summons. Dr. Ellison didn't look surprised when Lila showed it to her. "He's baiting you," she said. Lila raised an eyebrow. "Baiting me for what?" Ellison leaned back in her chair. "For control. For narrative. If he can bring you back under Harvard's roof, even symbolically, he can frame the story his way. You showed promise. You collaborated. You contributed." "But it was never collaboration," Lila replied. Ellison's gaze sharpened. "Exactly." Lila hesitated. "Should I go?" There was a long pause. "Only if you're ready," Ellison said. "Only if you know what line you're not willing to cross." The day arrived gray and cold. Elman Hall stood like a cathedral to old academia. Tall windows, wood paneling, names of donors etched into brass plaques by the doors. Lila stood outside for a moment, clutching her worn tote bag. She had dressed carefully, black slacks, a navy sweater, her hair pulled back, clean, simple, professional. Still. As she stepped inside, heads turned. Some recognized her. Others just sensed she didn't match the room. Dr. Mercer was already there, tall, impeccable, conversing with a cluster of colleagues who parted as she approached. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice smooth. "Thank you for coming." She nodded. "You didn't leave much room to decline." He smiled without warmth. "We value bold voices, especially ones that generate attention." She said nothing. He gestured toward the round table. 10 seats, 8 filled, 2 empty, 1 for her and 1 for something else. The discussion began politely. A researcher from Caltech presented a recursive hash model. A cryptographer from the University of Toronto proposed a post-linear cipher approximation. Comments were made. Heads nodded. Coffee was refilled. Then Mercer cleared his throat. "I'd like to pivot," he said, "to the more novel contributions in our field. Specifically, a new model introduced informally at MIT. Lila Carter. Would you care to share?" Eyes turned, not with mockery, with interest. Lila stood. She stepped to the whiteboard. She kept her voice steady. "This model approaches compression not through repetition, but through prediction. The structure of prime gaps, if treated as recursive boundaries instead of fixed sequences, creates a pattern of reduction not previously leveraged." She wrote as she spoke. Symbols flowed, terms collapsed. The room grew quiet. Mercer leaned back in his chair, studying her like a chess player waiting for a mistake. But it didn't come. When she finished, she stepped back. There was silence. Then someone, an older man with glasses, said, "Where did this come from?" Lila hesitated. "From seeing what didn't work. Over and over again. Until I saw why." Another voice. "Is this published?" "No," Lila said. "Not yet." Mercer's smile returned. "Well," he said, "that's something we should discuss." After the session, he asked her to stay behind. Everyone else filtered out slowly, murmuring, glancing. The door clicked shut. Mercer poured tea. "I'll be blunt," he said, turning to her. "Your work is extraordinary, but it's also raw. It lacks structure, context, formal direction." She said nothing. Mercer continued. "That kind of brilliance, untethered, often dies in obscurity. Or worse, gets misused." He walked to a shelf, pulled out a folder. "We'd like to help you formalize it." "We?" "The university, a private partner, a team who knows what to do with something like this." Lila's mouth was dry. "What would that mean?" "Resources, publishing support, protection." He met her eyes. And, of course, shared intellectual rights. There it was, the line. Lila said nothing for a long time. Then finally, "So, you want to own it?" Mercer blinked. "No. We want to shape it. Together. But yes. Legal clarity would be necessary." She stared at him. At the whiteboard behind him, still faint with the marks she'd made. And something inside her hardened. That night, back at home, Emily listened quietly as Lila recounted it. "No surprise," Emily said. Lila shook her head. "He didn't threaten me, but he made it sound like I'd be foolish not to hand it over." Emily looked up from the kitchen counter. "What do you want?" Lila opened her notebook, ran her fingers along a page with a coffee stain and a half-erased sketch. "I want people to see it," she whispered, "but I want it to still be mine when they do." The next day, Lila typed something for the first time. Not notes, not equations. A single paragraph. The Whittaker compression model is the result of independent mathematical development by Lila Carter. It is currently under academic review and has not been assigned or transferred to any private or institutional ownership. For inquiries regarding publication or peer review access, contact MIT Department of Advanced Mathematics. She emailed it to Dr. Ellison. The subject line: "My answer." Meanwhile, Dr. Mercer received a reply of his own. Short, direct. From the Legal Counsel of MIT. The intellectual property in question is protected under internal academic guidelines pending formal publication. Any claims of ownership or shared authorship outside of documented collaboration will be considered improper influence and contested accordingly. He read it twice, then leaned back in his chair, and finally, he frowned. The email came at 7:03 a.m. Lila Carter was halfway through pouring her second cup of coffee when the subject line stopped her breath. Invitation to submit, Journal of Advanced Modular Mathematics. She stared at the screen. MIT had nominated her. Dr. Ellison's name was at the bottom. So was Ashcroft's. So was the dean's. For the first time, her model wasn't being passed around in hushed seminars or murmured through cautious introductions. It was being invited into the world. By noon, Lila was in Dr. Ellison's office. She held the invitation printout in one hand and her notebook in the other. Ellison stood by the window, sipping black tea. "They're asking for a 12-page summary," Ellison said, "with full derivation and narrative framing. That means abstract, methodology, implications, and formal notation." Lila nodded, but didn't smile. Ellison noticed. "What's wrong?" Lila hesitated. Then, "What if I ruin it?" Ellison raised an eyebrow. "Ruin what?" "The model," Lila said. "What if I write it wrong? Too simple? Too complex? What if it reads like a janitor trying to play professor?" Ellison walked over slowly and placed a hand on the spiral notebook. "Then we revise. But what you've built doesn't break just because someone uses the wrong font. It lives deeper than that." Lila exhaled, but she didn't open her notebook yet. Because she wasn't afraid of the math. She was afraid of what came after. That night, Lila sat on the apartment floor, her back against the couch, a dozen printouts spread before her. Emily walked in, dropped her backpack, and immediately frowned. "Oh no." "What?" "You have the 'I'm about to panic over success' face again." Lila chuckled softly. "It's that obvious?" Emily dropped beside her. "To me, yeah. What's going on?" Lila handed her a draft. Emily scanned the first paragraph. "This paper proposes a recursive model of compression based on non-monotonic prime sequences under nonlinear constraints. The model..." Emily looked up. "Okay. Wow." Lila sighed. "Too technical?" Emily tilted her head. Not for the journal, no, but maybe too technical for the person who first wrote it while folding laundry and warming soup at 2 a.m. That landed. Hard. Because it was true. The voice in the paper didn't sound like hers. It sounded like someone trying to pass inspection. Later that night, Lila opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside, a purple spiral notebook, worn and soft, the front decorated with a glitter unicorn sticker, and the words, "My mom is a math superhero." Emily, age 9. She flipped through the pages, crayon drawings, scribbled fractions. One page labeled, "Top Secret." A stick figure of Lila next to a whiteboard with a speech bubble. "I solved something no one else could." Lila laughed under her breath, then cried. Because somehow... This was still more honest than anything she'd typed that week. The next morning, Lila walked into Ashcroft's office holding the purple notebook. She placed it on his desk, gently, like an offering. "I want to write the paper, but I want it to sound like me." Ashcroft, caught mid-sip, blinked. "Okay." She took a breath. "I know what the math means, but I also know what it meant when no one cared. I wrote the first draft of this model between night shifts, with bleach on my shoes, with a sick daughter on the couch, and I want the paper to say that." Ashcroft was quiet. Then, "You mean include a narrative component?" Lila nodded. "A short preface. Just a paragraph. Real. Not polished." Ashcroft exhaled slowly. "That'll ruffle feathers." "I'm not trying to be provocative," she said. "Just honest." Ashcroft stared at the unicorn sticker, then back at her, and smiled. "Then write it." But not everyone smiled. A week later, the preprint circulated among peer reviewers. One of them, a professor at another Ivy League school, emailed Ellison privately. "The mathematics is compelling, but the tone in the opening feels sentimental. The author may wish to remember that this is a journal, not a memoir." Ellison forwarded the comment to Lila, without editing it. Lila read it twice, then closed her laptop. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just felt tired. That night she told Emily, "They want me to cut the story." Emily didn't blink. "Then don't." Lila shrugged. "They say it's not academic." Emily leaned forward. "Mom, if you cut the story, you cut the point." Lila looked down at her hands. "They don't want me," she whispered. "They want the math, but not the mother, not the janitor, not the years in the dark." Emily grabbed her hand. "That's their mistake." The next morning, Lila wrote the preface again. She didn't ask permission. She didn't send it to Ashcroft first. She just typed it, as it came, and submitted the paper with one paragraph at the top. This model was built in silence, between mops and night shifts and unpaid bills. I am not a professor. I am a woman who saw a pattern when the world stopped looking. If this paper helps someone else believe their mind is still theirs, even in the dark, then it has done its job. 3 days later, a reply came from the journal's editorial board. Approved. No edits, no conditions. Just, accepted for publication volume 42. And a quiet note from the editor herself. I used to be a waitress. Thank you. Lila sat in stunned silence. then slowly opened the purple notebook, turned to a blank page and wrote, "Published. On my terms." But just as she closed her laptop, a second email arrived. No subject line, no message body, only one attachment. A copy of her just accepted paper, already downloaded. When she checked the file properties, a single line of metadata had been added. "We're listening. Proceed carefully." Lila froze. It hadn't come from MIT, hadn't come from the journal. Someone else was watching. She stared at the screen, heart pounding, and for the first time since Harvard, she felt it again. That the chalk dust on her hands wasn't just from math. It was from standing in places no one had meant for her to walk. The paper had been online for 72 hours. Lila Carter didn't expect it to cause waves. Not outside academia. Not beyond the quiet community of mathematicians who parsed equations over coffee and chalkboards. But somehow, it did. First, it was a message forwarded to her by Dr. Ellison. Who is this woman? Where did she come from? Why has no one heard of her until now? From a Stanford research fellow. Then, a LinkedIn message from a graduate student in Berlin. "I read your preface 5 times. I thought I was the only one working late in a grocery stockroom while solving modular theory on receipt paper." Then, a printed letter slid under her lab door. No name, just one line, written in blocky pencil on ruled notebook paper. "You make me think I can try again. M." Lila stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it neatly and tucked it into the purple notebook. The ripple had begun. By Friday afternoon, it was no longer a ripple. It was a knock, sharp, hesitant. 2 beats, then silence. Lila looked up from her whiteboard. "Come in?" The door opened slowly. A girl stepped in. 16, maybe 17. Oversized hoodie, chewed fingernails, a backpack hanging off one shoulder like she hadn't decided if she wanted to stay. Lila blinked. "Can I help you?" The girl held up a battered notebook, spiral-bound, edges frayed. I read your paper, the part at the top, about silence and night shifts." Lila stood slowly. The girl looked down. "I'm not from here, I'm from Lowell. I'm not a student. I come on Fridays, to the library, for Wi-Fi." Lila's voice softened. "What's your name?" "Gia." "Hi, Gia." Gia didn't smile. She clutched her notebook tighter. "I brought something," she mumbled, "but if it's stupid, I can leave." Lila extended a hand. "It's not stupid." Gia stepped forward and placed the notebook on the desk. Lila opened it. Page after page, equations in uneven handwriting. Mistakes, yes, but also insight. Patterns. A strange rhythm that felt oddly familiar. "This is modular fieldwork," Lila whispered. Gia shrugged. "I just see them. The gaps, the bends. I don't always know what I'm doing, but I can feel when it's wrong." Lila looked up. "I used to think that made me broken," Gia said. "It doesn't," Lila replied. "It means you're wired differently." Gia blinked, and for the first time since she entered the room, she smiled. Within 2 weeks, it happened again. Another girl, then 2, then 4. Some had questions. Some brought notes. Some didn't speak much at all. One came in crying. Another just sat in the corner and listened. Lila didn't advertise, didn't post flyers. She just started keeping the door open on Thursdays at 5:30 p.m. By 5:45, the room was usually full. They weren't students. They weren't prodigies. They were girls with notebooks full of scribbles and minds full of music no one had taught them to hear. Lila called it quietly, Whitaker Evenings. Not a class, not a club. Just a place to breathe. One Thursday, Dr. Ashcroft stopped by. He didn't enter, just stood in the doorway watching. Inside, a girl was sketching graphs on the whiteboard. Another was helping translate terms for someone who only spoke Spanish. Gia was laughing softly in the corner over a badly drawn number line shaped like a dinosaur. Ashcroft didn't interrupt. He just nodded and walked away. But he was smiling. Back in her office, Lila opened her laptop. The analytics on her paper had updated. Over 12,000 downloads. Requests for reprint had come from as far as Kyoto and Johannesburg. And yet, her inbox remained curiously quiet on one front. The other front. No more anonymous emails. No more metadata warnings. No shadowy threats. Just silence. Too silent. And that unnerved her more. Later that night, as she left campus, a man in a gray wool coat was standing near the main gate. He wasn't looking at her, just standing, reading a book he didn't seem to turn the pages of. Lila's stomach tensed. He wasn't anyone she recognized, and when she passed, he didn't look up. But she knew. The ripple had reached them too. Back at home, Emily was icing cupcakes. "For the girls?" Lila asked. Emily grinned. "Mid-session sugar saves lives." Lila leaned on the counter. "They're amazing." Emily looked up. "So are you." Lila exhaled. "Sometimes I still feel like I'm in someone else's story." Emily handed her a cupcake. "Then, keep rewriting it." That weekend, an email came from MIT's PR department. Subject: Feature Opportunity, Women in STEM Spotlight Series. They wanted to do a story. Photos, interview, full article. Lila almost said no. But then she thought of Gia. Of the girl who cried when someone finally said, "You belong here." Of the quiet knock on her door. Of the ripple she never meant to cause, but now refused to let fade. She replied with one word: yes. The room had no name, no dedication plaque, no donor title and brass script on the door. Just a plain metal number, 3-118. It used to be a supply storage room, unused for years. Now, it was something else entirely. Lila Carter pushed open the door and smiled. The walls had been repainted a soft gray. Someone from facilities, an old friend from her janitor days, had helped her fix the flickering light. Emily brought in foldable chairs. Gia brought markers. Someone else brought tea. There was no official sign, no budget. But it felt more alive than most seminar halls. This was the room with no plaque. And that made it theirs. Every Thursday evening, girls gathered. Some came after shifts at diners. Some came in hoodies, smelling like engine grease or school cafeteria lunches. One girl brought her toddler and solved integrals with one arm while bouncing a baby with the other. They didn't ask for credit. They didn't care about degrees. They cared about the math, the way it danced when no one told you it had to stay still. Lila stood before them, not as Dr. anything, just as a woman who'd once solved equations between bleach stains and broken sleep. And that was enough. One night, a girl raised her hand. Her voice was soft. "How do you deal with people who say you don't belong?" Lila paused, then walked over to the whiteboard and wrote 2 words. "Belong anyway." She tapped the board once. "It's not an answer," she said. "It's a decision." The room went quiet. Then one by one, heads nodded. Because they knew. By the end of the month, word had spread across campus. A few professors raised eyebrows. A few students mocked it under their breath. The Empathy Equation Club. But others were curious. And one afternoon, a man came by. Knocked politely. Mid-40s. Light brown hair. Neatly combed. Glasses. Pressed gray shirt. No visible badge. No university logo. Lila opened the door. "Can I help you?" He smiled calmly. "Dr. Carter, sorry, Ms. Carter," he corrected. "I'm here with the Federal Research Integrity Office. You can call me Alan." She blinked. "Federal?" He held up a laminated card, official but vague, nothing flashy. "We monitor open-source research that has potential national security implications," he said, voice measured. "I'd love just 15 minutes of your time." Lila didn't move. "Is this about the Whitaker model?" she asked. Alan smiled again. "It's not a concern, more of a conversation." Lila hesitated, then opened the door wider. They sat in the corner. Gia watched warily from across the room. Alan crossed one leg over the other, pulled out a small notebook. "We've reviewed your publication," he began. "Brilliant work. In fact, parts of it have reached our colleagues at NIST and the Department of Energy." Lila said nothing. "Some of the principles you outline, recursive field collapse, non-linear compression over unstable primes, could have unforeseen implications." "Like what?" she asked. He looked directly at her. "Like breaking things we currently think are secure." Lila's mouth went dry. "I didn't publish it to break anything," she said. "I believe you." There was a pause. "But you made it open source," Alan continued, "and that means anyone can run with it." Lila leaned forward. "That's the point. So the right people can run with it too." Alan closed his notebook gently. "We'd like to propose a different kind of partnership. Discreet, supportive, not restrictive, but with oversight. Just enough to ensure this work doesn't misland." Misland? Fall into hands that use brilliance for control instead of collaboration. Lila stood. Her voice was low. "Are you asking me to stop?" Alan shook his head. "We're asking you to think about where you want your work to live. That's all." He stood, adjusted his cuffs. "You'll get a letter next week. No rush. Just think about it." He offered a hand. Lila didn't take it. As he left, Gia walked over. "Who was that?" Lila stared at the door. "Someone who doesn't want a plaque," she whispered. "He wants a key." That night, Lila walked the perimeter of campus alone. The wind was sharp, her coat thin. Thoughts spun faster than her steps. She remembered folding laundry while Emily did homework on the floor. Remembered solving the recursive limit the first time, with her fingers numb from cleaning chemicals and exhaustion. Remembered whispering proofs under her breath like prayers. None of those people were in rooms like this. None of them had ever been invited. But somehow, they were knocking now. And not all of them were bringing cupcakes. Back in her apartment, she opened her purple notebook. Tucked inside was the folded letter from that girl named M. "You make me think I can try again." Lila touched the words, and then, without overthinking, she grabbed a pen and wrote, "This work began in silence. It does not belong behind locked doors. Let them watch. I'll leave the lights on." 3 days later, the envelope arrived. Official seal, heavy paper. No return address. Lila didn't open it. She slid it into the back of her notebook, behind the purple one, and then walked into room 3118 like she always did. 10 girls were waiting. They weren't afraid, so she wouldn't be either. The envelope was still in the back of her purple notebook. Lila hadn't opened it, but the real question had shifted, from if she should open it to why they had sent it in the first place. The next morning, outside room 3118, a different envelope appeared. No seal, no return address, no threat, just 2 clean, neatly printed pages titled, Draft of Strategic Research Partnership. No logos, no gold leaf, just words. But words that meant control. To support the continued exploration of the Whittaker model, the department will provide full federal protection for intellectual assets, a $4.2 million unrestricted research grant, a permanent research facility within MIT's Gray Building, lifetime academic fellowship and personal security. In exchange for exclusive shared access to all derivative applications, coordination of public release through approved channels, no open source distribution without prior review. Lila sat at the corner of her small kitchen, her eyes locked on the final clause. No open source distribution without prior review. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from something else, a cold realization that what they were offering was a cage dressed as freedom. Outside, Boston's skies had turned steel gray. Wind rattled her apartment windows like fingers trying to get in. Emily placed a warm cup of tea beside her. "I know," Emily said. Lila blinked. "Know what?" Emily sat. "The letter. The government." Lila didn't reply. Emily smiled faintly. "I've lived long enough beside you to know the face you make when you're doing moral math." Lila exhaled. "Why me, Em?" she whispered. "Why give me the key? I'm not a top physicist. I'm not even faculty." Emily shrugged. "Maybe because you're not. Maybe they trust you just enough to want you silent." Later that afternoon, a new girl arrived in room 3118. 12 years old. Black hair tied unevenly to one side. Eyes too grown up for her age. The kind of eyes that had learned to be silent when the world preferred noise. Her name was Luna. She didn't speak much, but she walked to the whiteboard with a hand-drawn spiral based on the Fibonacci sequence, numbers curling into form like galaxies. "What do you see in this?" Lila asked. Luna tapped the spiral with a finger. "It looks like a clock," she whispered. "But it doesn't just count time. It waits. And then things unlock." Lila looked at her, stunned, without formulas, without context. This child had sketched the core intuition behind the Whittaker model, not with logic, with instinct. That night, Lila climbed to the old clock tower above the physics building, long abandoned, its gears frozen in place. From here, you could see the outline of Boston's government buildings, their lights always on, their windows always watching. She pulled out her phone. A new text message from Alan. Just 5 words. "Have you made a decision?" She didn't reply. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a wooden box. Inside were slips of paper, anonymous notes left by girls in room 3118. "I didn't know I could be good at math. You made me want to try again. They called me dumb. Now I know. They just didn't see. I think I'm a little like you." Lila stared at the city, silent, strong, cold. Then slowly she pulled the contract from her coat pocket and tore it in half. The pieces danced away in the wind, falling like early snow. The next morning, she sent a simple email. "This model was born without permission. It will live the same way." The government didn't reply. No black vans showed up. No knocks came at midnight. But she knew better. They weren't gone. They were waiting, hoping she'd trip. So she returned to room 3118, where Luna now stood smiling, pointing at a new diagram, where hope walked barefoot in between equations, where math didn't belong to the powerful. It belonged to those who still believed in trying. No plaques, no locks, only light. And Lila left the door open. There was no thunder, no great announcement, just a knock on the door of room 3118. Lila opened it, expecting another student. Instead, it was a woman in her late 50s. Warm eyes, worn blazer, a clipboard in hand, and exhaustion etched into the wrinkles of her smile. "Miss Carter?" "Yes?" The woman extended a hand. "I'm Principal Dana Shepard. I run Blakeview Middle School in Dorchester." Lila tilted her head. "That's, quite a distance." "Yes," the woman chuckled. "About 40 minutes by train. But that didn't stop 10 of my girls from skipping lunch yesterday just to watch one of your online lectures." "Online?" Lila blinked. Principal Shepard pulled out her phone. A grainy recording, clearly student shot, showed Lila explaining a concept from the Whittaker model on the whiteboard. That was supposed to be private. Nothing stays private when you light up kids who've been told they're shadows. Lila smiled faintly. "Why are you here?" The woman breathed in. "We've cleared out the storage building next to our cafeteria. It's not much, but if you'd consider bringing 3118 there, even once a week?" Lila didn't answer right away. She stared at the floor, then at the room behind her. Gia was showing Luna a new trick with matrices. Emily was fixing a light bulb. A girl named Reese had brought in her little brother, who was coloring spirals on the floor. This wasn't a lab. This wasn't even a classroom. It was something else. 1 week later, a folding table stood beneath a flickering fluorescent light inside a brick shed behind Blakeview Middle. There were no chairs, no projectors, no chalkboards, but there were 12 girls. Some held their younger siblings. Some didn't speak. Some stared at the ground, afraid of numbers like they were barbed wire. Lila set down a single notebook, the purple one. "This isn't a math class," she said. "This is a place to try again." She drew a circle, then a spiral, then a single equation. The room stayed quiet, until one hand rose. "Is this that thing from Harvard?" Lila nodded. "Then why are we doing it?" Lila looked at her, at all of them. "Because Harvard never needed it. You do." Weeks passed. Word spread. Lila never called it a school, never accepted pay, never asked permission. But every Friday, that room filled. Not just with girls, but their siblings, cousins, neighbors. Some stayed, some just watched through the window. And every week the spiral returned, sometimes in chalk, sometimes in thread, sometimes in how a girl carried herself just a little taller. Then one day, a man showed up. Jeans, flannel shirt, a former engineer turned tech blogger. "I heard about the spiral thing," he said. "Thought it was a cult. But then my daughter came home and explained recursion better than I could." He smiled sheepishly. "Can I watch?" Lila handed him a folding chair. 3 months later, the Blakeview sessions had expanded to 4 cities. Not because Lila planned it, but because the model leaked. Not through white papers, not through academia, but through notebooks, drawn in purple ink, by the girls, passed between hands like treasure maps. A single mother in Minneapolis wrote to her, "My daughter was diagnosed with a learning disability. Now she builds bridges out of spirals. I don't know what you did, but you brought her back to me." A teacher in Albuquerque. "We're using your model to explain trauma processing to teens. We call it healing math. Hope that's okay." A therapist in Detroit. "I use it with girls who self-harm. Turns out equations can be safer than mirrors." Lila kept teaching. She never copyrighted the model, never trademarked it. She never signed another contract. But the model went global. And one spring afternoon, at a modest TED-style conference for underserved education in Chicago, Lila stepped onto a small wooden stage. No suit, no title, just jeans, a plain shirt, and that same old purple notebook in her hand. The audience expected a technical lecture. But Lila began with a story. When I was younger, I used to clean hallways for men who didn't know my name. One night, I found an equation that had no beginning, no ending, just motion. I used to think math was for the powerful. Then I realized it's for the ones who've lost their voices. Because math doesn't care what you wear. Math doesn't need you to be loud. It just needs you to try. Someone in the back began to cry. Lila smiled. I didn't build a school, she said. I just left the door open. And somewhere, on a porch in the middle of a dry town in New Mexico, a girl with burnt hands and a spiral notebook whispered to herself, "Let there be light."